Jasmine Crockett walked into court wearing a simple cross and was fined $1,000 on the spot. But just 5 minutes later, she flipped the courtroom on its head. That moment led to the shocking arrest of Justice Amy Coney Barrett and exposed a decade of religious bias from the bench. How did one necklace bring down a federal judge? And what else has the system been hiding behind the robe? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The wind outside the West Wing windows screamed like a warning, but Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on the urgent email flashing on her encrypted screen. POTUSPRIORITY. Observe civil court session in D.C. suspected systemic religious liberty violation. Remain anonymous. No attachments, no names, just a red flag waving in silence. Jasmine had seen this pattern before. In courtrooms where prayers were punished, where faith was labeled disruption. She defended veterans, immigrants, and single mothers silenced by fear. Now something bigger was moving. She stood, grabbed her coat, and opened the drawer. Inside, a silver crucifix on a tarnished chain, her father's, a fallen soldier. She clipped it on without hesitation, not for show, for strength. The battlefield was no longer overseas. It was inside the law itself, and she was walking straight into it. The courthouse loomed like a fortress, cold, gray, and echoing with the footsteps of the weary and the wronged. Jasmine moved past the security checkpoint with calm precision, handing over ID marked simply, J. Crockett, Independent Counsel. No badges, no mention of the White House, just enough to earn entry, not attention. The courtroom was packed, rows filled with ordinary citizens, teachers, veterans, parents, many clutching Bibles or rosaries, eyes heavy with frustration. They weren't criminals. They were plaintiffs, victims of whispered policies that banned public prayer in city parks, hospital waiting rooms, and even school parking lots. Jasmine felt it, the kind of tension that thickens the air, the kind that says something's wrong here, and everyone knows it. As she found her seat near the back, a security officer in a wrinkled uniform leaned close, voice barely above a breath. If you want no trouble, you might want to take that cross off. Justice Barrett doesn't like symbols. Jasmine didn't even blink. She turned slightly, just enough to meet the guard's eyes, and smiled. Not out of politeness, but with the stillness of a loaded weapon. Her fingers brushed the cross at her collar, then rested on her lap, unmoved. Noted, she said, her voice low, calm, final. The man hesitated, then backed away, disappearing into the wood-paneled shadows. Around her no one noticed, but Jasmine did. The warning wasn't about dress code. It was about power, and the way it trembled when someone refused to kneel. The silence that followed the guard's warning hadn't settled for more than a minute when the room shifted, like air pressure dropping before a storm. The double doors of the courtroom groaned open. Not fast, not loud, but slow and deliberate, as if announcing the arrival of someone who didn't need theatrics to command fear. Every head turned. The whispers died. Justice Amy Coney Barrett entered with the precision of a pendulum and the weight of a gavel already falling. Her robes were perfectly pressed, her steps measured, her chin slightly raised. Not out of arrogance, but authority carved over years of commanding obedience. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. Her presence alone drew the room into silence tighter than any court order. This was her domain, her courtroom, and the rules were whatever she decided they were that day. Her eyes scanned the gallery like floodlights sweeping a prison yard. They passed over restless feet, anxious hands, trembling folders, until they landed, sharp and unblinking, on Jasmine Crockett. It took less than a second. The cross on Jasmine's chest caught the fluorescent light, just enough to glint, and just enough to provoke. Barrett stopped mid-step. Her face didn't change, but her focus locked in with unsettling precision. She raised a single unshaking hand and pointed, not at Jasmine's face, not at her seat, but directly at her necklace. Her voice cut through the courtroom with a coldness that didn't need to be loud. It was clean, surgical. You there, that necklace violates this court's neutrality. Remove it, immediately. The impact was instant. A few gasps escaped. Papers rustled. A mother in the back clutched her purse closer. Even the court clerk paused, fingers hovering over her keyboard. But Jasmine didn't move. The chain around her neck, worn and dulled with time, rested calmly over her collarbone, as steady as her heartbeat. Justice Barrett didn't repeat herself. She didn't have to. The tension in the room thickened, stretching into the space between them, like a drawn wire. This wasn't a dress code issue. It wasn't protocol. It was a line drawn in silence, and Jasmine had just been dared to cross it. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Not when the courtroom fell dead silent, not under the sharp weight of Justice Barrett's stare, and not when the unspoken threat hung thick in the air like smoke before a fire. She remained seated, posture upright, shoulders squared, her breath steady like someone trained to keep calm under fire. Her fingers, resting gently on the armrest, didn't tremble. Instead, one hand moved slowly, almost ceremonially, to brush the silver cross on her chest. A deliberate gesture, a silent refusal. She met Barrett's eyes across the courtroom, gaze steady and unyielding. There was no anger, no arrogance, only a stillness that said, "You may hold the bench, but I will not bend." And then, with a voice low, unwavering, and sharp enough to cut through the tension, she replied, "No." The word dropped like a match into dry hay. Instant ignition. A collective gasp rippled across the courtroom, as if the crowd had been holding their breath. The court clerk's fingers froze above the keys. The bailiff turned his head, unsure if he was about to witness defiance or history. Justice Barrett's lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw tightening beneath the harsh lights. And then, with cold precision, she reached for the gavel. The sound when it struck the bench was thunderous, violent, final. "Contempt of court," she announced, her voice louder now, rising with the force of barely restrained fury. $1,000, payable before you leave this courtroom." Gas spread like wildfire. The clerk hesitated before typing. Even the bailiff shifted uneasily, as if unsure whether this was justice or something darker. But what Justice Barrett mistook for surrender was something far more deliberate, control cloaked in restraint. Jasmine didn't wince. She didn't flinch. Her face remained unreadable, carved from something harder than pride, steadier than fear. The courtroom's silence seemed to press in on her from all sides, but she moved with the stillness of someone who lived through louder wars. Slowly, calmly, she rose from her seat. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice. Every step toward the front of the room was measured, precise, like walking a tightrope over a canyon of consequence. The click of her heels echoed through the gallery, steady and certain, slicing through the tension like a metronome counting down to impact. All eyes tracked her, breath held, uncertain of what came next. Protest? Collapse? Concession? She reached the podium and paused. Then, with the grace of someone unfazed by courtroom theatrics, Jasmine slipped a hand into the inner pocket of her blazer. From it, she withdrew a slim black wallet, no larger than a passport, and opened it with a single, fluid motion. The leather creaked softly as it unfolded, revealing a polished badge embossed in gold, flanked by an official federal seal and an ID card beneath it. The words glinted under the courtroom lights. Executive Office, Civil Oversight Division, Special Federal Authority. She held the badge high, her voice calm but clear, slicing through the thick silence with the sharpness of truth. "My name is Jasmine Crockett. I am Senior Legal Advisor to the President of the United States, assigned by executive order to oversee civil court compliance with constitutional rights. I am here under full federal authority." She didn't need to raise her voice. The weight of those words did all the work. A ripple moved through the room. Shock, disbelief, then realization. Justice Barrett's stare didn't waver, but her posture shifted. Just enough for those watching closely to see it. The woman behind the bench had issued judgment, but the woman before her had just taken the gavel and rewritten the rules. And as the courtroom grappled with the weight of her badge and title, Jasmine did not let the silence settle. She weaponized it. Lowering the leather wallet with deliberate care, Jasmine placed it on the podium like a final card in a high-stakes game. Her voice came next, not loud but focused, clear, and impossible to ignore. This courtroom, she said, pausing just enough for the silence to pull tighter around her words, does not stand above the Constitution, and no official in this room, not even Your Honor, has the right to override it. Every syllable landed with weight, striking through the haze of shock like iron dropped on glass. People turned in their seats, some slowly, others all at once, as if finally seeing the shape of what was unfolding. Even the court clerk, frozen in front of her keyboard, leaned forward now, lips parted slightly. Jasmine didn't move her shoulders, didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. The authority in her voice wasn't drawn from emotion. It came from the law itself. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution, she continued, guarantees every citizen the right to freely exercise their faith, without coercion, without punishment, and without fear. She took one measured step closer to the bench, the distance shrinking, the stakes rising. Her gaze met Barrett's directly. No malice, no plea, only a piercing clarity that cut through the facade of robes and formality. By demanding I remove this cross, she said, touching the symbol resting against her chest, you have not defended neutrality. You have violated it, because neutrality is not silence. It is equal treatment. A few audible gasps flickered through the room, the tension now not only palpable, but visible in how people sat, breathed, watched. Jasmine let the moment expand, then delivered the strike. I invoke the 1993 Supreme Court precedent, Church of Lukumi Babalu Aye, Sir City of Hialeah. That ruling, binding and clear, held that the government cannot impose restrictions that specifically target religious expression under the false banner of order or neutrality. The court in that decision made it crystal clear. When power singles out faith, even subtly, it ceases to be justice. It becomes oppression. Her words hung in the air, sharpened by the undeniable truth behind them. There was no theatrics, no dramatic pause for applause, just the sound of reality settling like thunder before the storm. Jasmine Crockett wasn't performing. She was indicting. And as the echoes of precedent faded into the charged silence, Jasmine didn't stop. She turned the mirror back onto the court itself and forced it to look. Her tone didn't rise, but her words carried more force than a shouted accusation. They were methodical, sharpened, and deliberate, like a surgeon cutting through illusion. Let's examine the standard being enforced here, she said, slowly turning her head to scan the courtroom. Because what you call neutrality, what you just used to justify a $1,000 fine, isn't being applied equally. Her hand gestured lightly, not with drama, but with clarity. To my left, a man sits in full view wearing a t-shirt that displays explicit language that would violate most workplace policies, let alone the dignity of this courtroom. And yet, not a word was said. She turned slightly, eyes falling on another. To my right, a woman entered this room with a gold-plated pendant shaped like a cannabis leaf, oversized, flashing under the lights. No objection, no demand to remove it. No accusations of disrupting the room's so-called neutrality. She took a step closer to the bench, not aggressive, but direct, unblinking. Behind me, a young man is wearing earrings so large and loud, I heard them jangle through the clerk's opening roll call. Still, nothing. And there, she pointed briefly, a visitor with a hoodie that reads, "Trust no one," in bold red letters. Cynical, antagonistic, suggestive. Yet not one comment, not one reprimand. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the very walls were closing in on the false sense of order that had just been exposed. Jasmine's voice lowered, not to whisper, but to focus every syllable like a scalpel. But when I entered wearing a silver cross, no sound, no message, no protest, that's when the gavel dropped. That's when the court found its voice. She paused, locking eyes with Justice Barrett, letting the truth sit heavy between them. That isn't about order. It isn't about neutrality. It's about what makes you uncomfortable. Her tone didn't waver. You tolerated expression until that expression was faith. You ignored distraction until that distraction was belief. And you stayed silent until that silence spoke of something sacred. She let the silence build one more time before landing the final blow. That's not justice. That's discrimination wearing a black robe. And just as Jasmine's final words hung heavy in the courtroom like smoke after gunfire, the tension snapped, not from the bench, but from the silence that had been forced on someone who knew too much for far too long. From behind the clerk's desk, there was movement, small at first, hesitant, but unmistakable. A chair scraped softly against the floor. The court's senior stenographer, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pinned tightly at the back of her head, slowly stood. For years, she had been part of the courtroom's furniture, present, precise, and invisible. Her fingers had typed every ruling, every order, every silence masquerading as protocol. But now her hands no longer hovered over the keyboard. They moved with a different purpose. Reaching beneath her desk, she pulled out a large, weathered manila folder. Its edges were frayed, corners curled from age and use. A single red string wrapped tightly around it. Not neatly, but with the urgency of something hidden. Something someone once tried to forget. The woman stepped out from behind the desk, her heels echoing across the marble like a slow drum beat. The room didn't breathe. No one stopped her. She walked straight to Jasmine, holding the folder close to her chest like a confession, and then, without ceremony, extended it. Her voice when she spoke cracked slightly, but not from fear. From the weight of truth finally being released. I've kept these records off the books. 23 rulings, all with one thing in common. Justice Barrett handed down harsher sentences when the defendants wore crosses, carried prayer beads, or spoke of their faith. No one believed me. Or maybe they didn't want to. Jasmine took the folder slowly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes razor-sharp. Around the room, heads turned. No one whispered. No one dared. The courtroom had shifted again, this time under the gravity of evidence. And with that single act, the narrative cracked wide open. It was no longer a matter of opinion. It was record. It was pattern. It was proof. And as Jasmine clutched the folder in her hands, truth bundled in paper and silence, she knew it was no longer a matter of testimony. It was time to show them. She moved with quiet purpose across the courtroom, the thick manila file pressed tightly to her side, like a weapon both sacred and damning. The courtroom projector sat dormant in the corner, ignored by most, forgotten by others. But Jasmine turned toward it with precise intent. She handed the folder to the bailiff, her voice calm but firm. "Display these." One by one. Her fingers tapped the podium with the rhythm of resolve, not hesitation. The bailiff hesitated for half a second, then obeyed. The screen lit up with a flicker, and then settled into a grainy courtroom still. Jasmine faced the gallery now, not the bench, her voice clear as glass. "Exhibit 1, she said. The image was unmistakable. A school courtroom, a skinny teenage boy standing stiffly in front of the judge's bench. His shoulders were hunched, his hands clasped in front of him, and around his neck, just barely visible above his hoodie, was a thin silver cross. He was 15, Jasmine continued, accused of a hallway altercation. First offense, no serious injuries. Recommended sentence, 2 weeks community service. Actual ruling?" She turned toward the bench. 60 days in juvenile detention. Reason listed in the court notes. Displayed religious symbolism in a defiant manner. The murmurs began immediately, low at first, then louder. Jasmine didn't respond. She simply nodded to the bailiff. Next. The screen shifted. Now a photo of a courtroom hallway. A young man, early 20s, dressed in a modest shirt and jeans, being led out by 2 bailiffs. His head was covered with a traditional Muslim hijab, not elaborate, not even political, just faith. He was attending a civil mediation between family members, Jasmine narrated. He was quiet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. She let the words settle before continuing. He was removed from the courtroom before the hearing even began. On-record reason, potential distraction due to attire. She looked toward Barrett now slowly. Unconstitutional, unjustified, unanswered. A ripple of discomfort rolled through the room, now visibly changing in posture. People who had once sat with passive attention were leaning forward, lips tight, brows furrowed. Jasmine's expression remained neutral, controlled, but never cold. Next, she said again. The third slide was the clearest yet. A still frame, zoomed in from courtroom footage. A middle-aged woman in a navy blue dress sat at the witness stand, her face pale, her mouth half open mid-sentence. On her wrist, a wooden string of Buddhist prayer beads, no larger than a bracelet. She was testifying in her divorce case, Jasmine explained. She had not violated any rules of decorum. She had not raised her voice. She was stopped mid-testimony. She paused, letting that land. Court record states, visibly agitated, wearing religious accessories. Her testimony was stricken, her affidavit excluded. The courtroom shifted again, but this time something deeper cracked. The murmurs were no longer passive. A woman in the back row placed her hand over her chest. A man whispered angrily to his wife. Another shook his head slowly, lips pressed in disbelief. And amid it all, Jasmine stood still. Not triumphant, not performative, just present, letting the truth speak where justice had failed. She turned slightly, her voice lowering, tone sharpened. All three cases occurred in this courtroom. All three were presided over by Justice Barrett. All three were dismissed or penalized on grounds that clearly reflect a pattern, not of maintaining order, but of silencing faith. She looked directly at the judge now. A crucifix, a hijab, a prayer bead. Three faiths, three people, one courtroom, one common result, punishment. Barrett remained motionless. No rebuke, no denial. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench, but her posture betrayed the weight now crushing the authority she had once wielded unchallenged. Jasmine took a step back from the podium, her voice now even and quiet, but every word landing with impact. This isn't about a dress code. It's not about decorum. It's not even about the rule of law. She glanced at the gallery, every eye fixed on her. It's about power deciding whose beliefs are welcome and whose are dangerous. It's about faith being treated like a threat and symbols of devotion punished like rebellion. She paused, letting the screen dim slowly behind her, the last image flickering before fading to black. The silence that followed was not like the one before. It was heavier. It wasn't just stunned. It was loaded with realization. For the first time since the trial began, the crowd wasn't just watching a conflict. They were witnessing a reckoning. And Jasmine didn't have to say it aloud, because now everyone in that room already knew. This courtroom had rules, but they hadn't been applied. Not equally, not fairly, not legally. And just as the final image faded from the screen and the last word left Jasmine's lips, Justice Barrett shifted in her seat, her hand moving toward the gavel as if to reclaim control. Her fingers tightened around the polished wood, knuckles whitening. She opened her mouth, poised to speak, to reassert her power with one more ruling, perhaps to silence Jasmine, to strike her words from the record, or to issue yet another fine. But she never got the chance. The double doors of the courtroom swung open with a sudden, resounding force, like a thunderclap tearing through a storm. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-breath, and then they entered. 4 federal agents, crisp black suits, steel in their eyes and urgency in every step. They moved quickly but without panic, measured and trained. Their presence alone overpowered the room, as if justice had taken human form and stepped into the heart of its own corruption. The lead agent approached the bench without pause, pulling a trifold document from his coat. His voice was calm, authoritative, and crystal clear. "Justice Amy Coney Barrett," he declared, holding the document high for all to see. The golden seal of the Department of Justice catching the light. "You are hereby placed under federal investigation for repeated violations of the First Amendment, abuse of judicial discretion, and systemic religious discrimination in your courtroom." The words hit the chamber like a detonation. Gasps rippled through the gallery, sharp, visceral, unstoppable. Some clutched the benches, others whispered in disbelief, but no one moved. No one dared to interrupt what was unfolding. The agent continued, his tone unwavering. "We have a signed warrant for your immediate removal and detention. You are to come with us, now." Barrett froze. The color drained from her face. Her mouth, still half open from the sentence she never finished, now trembled slightly. The gavel remained in her hand, but it no longer meant anything. Power, once absolute, had collapsed into silence. She stood slowly, stiffly, her eyes not meeting anyone's. Not the gallery, not the clerk, not even Jasmine. Her composure cracked just for a breath as the agent stepped closer. Then came the moment no one in that room would forget, the metallic click of handcuffs locking around her wrists. It was louder than the gavel, louder than the whispering, louder than anything she had said all day. From the back row, a single voice broke the stunned silence. A man, older, weary, his voice hoarse but full of raw truth, spoke with quiet power. Justice has finally arrived. That was it. No cheering, no applause, just truth echoing off the walls of a courtroom that had too long forgotten what justice looked like. Barrett was led past the gallery, her shoulders squared but her steps heavy. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. She simply walked, past the people she once silenced, past the bench that no longer obeyed her, and past the cross on Jasmine Crockett's chest, which remained exactly where it had always been. Jasmine stood motionless at the podium, watching as the agents led Barrett out through the very doors she had once entered with such command. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She didn't move to claim victory. She only stood firm, calm, composed, resolute, as if she had seen this moment long before it happened. The courtroom that once sought to punish her now bore witness to something far greater, accountability in its purest form. And as the heavy courtroom doors closed behind Justice Barrett and the last echo of the handcuffs faded, a new silence fell, not empty, but cleansed. Jasmine stood still for a moment longer than anyone else, letting the weight of what had just happened settle into her bones. Then, without a word, she turned away from the podium, her heels clicking slowly across the marble floor, each step steady, grounded, and final. As she approached the exit, the crowd parted wordlessly, making way not for a hero, not for a celebrity, but for a woman who had stood alone and never once lowered her voice or her gaze. The air outside the courtroom felt colder, sharper, like the world was holding its breath. Jasmine reached the bottom of the courthouse steps, paused under the harsh glow of the midday sun, and lifted her hand to her neck. With slow fingers, she unclasped the thin chain of the silver cross that had started it all. She didn't wear it now out of rebellion or fear. She held it, tightly, deliberately, fist clenched around metal that had become more than a symbol. It was a promise, a vow, a reminder that some truths are worth bleeding for, even in silence. The media explosion didn't wait. It ignited. Within minutes of Barrett's removal, phones buzzed, news alerts flashed, and camera crews raced to the courthouse steps. But Jasmine didn't speak to the press. She didn't need to. The story had already written itself, and the country was reading it in real time. Online, hashtags surged like wildfire. Crossfire was first, trending nationally within 15 minutes. Then came hashtag Barrett bias, picked up by legal watchdogs and civil rights organizations, with screenshots, transcripts, and courtroom footage already circulating. But the one that captured the nation's pulse was number Faith Under Fire, a battle cry that swept across states, ideologies, and belief systems. It wasn't about religion alone. It was about power, misused, exposed, confronted. In churches and mosques, in coffee shops and courthouses, people were talking. Veterans who had fought for freedom posted their own stories of being silenced in public spaces. Students reposted videos of being disciplined for prayer on campus. Parents shared photos of children with religious jewelry blurred in school portraits. The nation had seen injustice before, but never in such plain daylight, never so publicly undone. And at the heart of the storm stood Jasmine Crockett, not speaking, not posting, not seeking credit. She simply returned to her office in the West Wing, laid the silver cross gently on her desk beside the file folder that had cracked a judge's career, and sat in silence. She knew the storm had only begun, but for once, it wasn't swallowing the truth. It was clearing space for it. Within hours, the president took to the podium in the White House press briefing room. He wasn't flanked by advisors or shielded by talking points. His tone was firm, solemn, unmistakably direct. "What happened in that courtroom today?" he began, pausing as the room fell silent. was not just a confrontation between one woman and one judge. It was a mirror held up to the justice system, a reflection we've ignored for too long. He adjusted the microphone, his gaze unwavering. Thanks to Jasmine Crockett, we didn't just protect faith, we exposed systemic rot, and now we begin the work of removing it. Flashbulbs burst, reporters fired questions, but the message had already hit the front page of every major outlet in America. WH advisor confronts judge in court, religious discrimination uncovered. Jasmine Crockett holds court accountable, Barrett removed in real time. In just 24 hours, the story wasn't just national, it was personal. Households across the country debated the footage. Church groups rallied behind Jasmine. Law professors assigned her courtroom defense to constitutional law students. And within Congress, pressure mounted. Hearings were proposed, reform bills were drafted. Civil rights groups demanded judicial audits across all 50 states. Meanwhile, Jasmine remained quiet, not because she was hiding, but because she knew something louder than words was now speaking for her. The truth, finally unshackled. She didn't return to the spotlight immediately. Instead, she worked late into the night at her desk, cross-resting in the center like a compass. Her inbox flooded with messages, from young interns to retired judges, each carrying a common thread. You gave us courage. But Jasmine didn't seek celebration. She was focused on the next step. Accountability had begun, but change still had to be written into law. Back in the courtroom she had just left hours before, the judge's bench sat empty, cold, exposed, and for the first time in years, humble. The American flag behind it fluttered softly from the draft through the open doors. And across the city, in offices and chambers, people were asking one another hard questions. Who else had ruled unfairly? Who else had been silenced? Who would be next to stand? But they all knew one name, spoken in every newsroom, whispered in every hallway, etched now into the lexicon of justice: Jasmine Crockett. And on social media, where moments die fast and headlines fade even faster, her story stayed. Not as a fleeting trend, but as a watershed, a symbol, a shift. The hashtags didn't just trend. They carved themselves into the record of a nation at a crossroads. In homes where prayers had once been whispered quietly, they were now said aloud. In courtrooms where symbols were once banned, they began to reappear, silent, proud, unashamed. And in the hearts of millions who had once felt powerless, something stirred. The belief that one voice, held firm in the face of power, could ignite change far beyond a courtroom. The cross in Jasmine's hand had not been decoration. It had been defiance. And now, across a divided nation, it had become a beacon. And as the headlines roared and the public demanded more than applause, they demanded action. Jasmine Crockett stepped not away from the fire, but deeper into it. The storm she had ignited in one courtroom had rolled across the country, cracking open doors long sealed shut. But Jasmine hadn't stood that day for a moment of glory. She had stood for change, real change. And the White House knew it. Within days of the courtroom confrontation, her name rose from viral hashtag to official nomination. In a unanimous executive appointment, Jasmine Crockett was named senior advisor for the reform of judicial religious protections, a new role carved by necessity, forged from truth. She was no longer just an enforcer of the law. Now she was tasked with rebuilding part of it. Her new office wasn't far from the Oval, but it felt worlds apart from the courtroom where it all began. Glass walls, steel shelves, thick folders already stacked high, cases, statistics, audit reports. Every corner whispered urgency, but amid the modern furnishings and clean lines, one object stood out. Jasmine stood before it in silence the morning she moved in. A small frame, mounted at eye level, hung on the wall just to the left of her desk. Inside, a simple 8.5 by 11 slip of official court paper, a receipt for $1,000. Time-stamped, signed, stamped, paid. The fine issued against her for wearing a cross in a public courtroom. She had paid it the very next day, not in defeat, but with purpose. Not because she owed them silence, but because she owed herself the reminder. Beneath the receipt, etched into a thin plaque of brushed steel, were the words she had written by hand before handing it to the framer. One fine for staying silent can cost generations their voice. The staff that passed her office often stopped to read it. Some stood there for minutes absorbing the message. Others walked away with tears in their eyes. And Jasmine? She looked at it every morning, just once, before sitting at her desk. It wasn't a wound. It was a weapon, a warning. And it reminded her of exactly what she was fighting. Systems that mistake silence for peace. From that office, she began to move. Carefully, relentlessly. Her team, handpicked, wasn't made of politicians, but of people who had once been victims of the very system they were now empowered to fix. Former public defenders, civil rights advocates, faith leaders from across the religious spectrum. Together, they reviewed over 10,000 pages of past judicial behavior, scanning for signs of religious bias. The pattern was undeniable. The silence that once protected injustice was being peeled back, layer by layer, under Jasmine's direction. She pushed for mandatory First Amendment retraining for all federal judges. She drafted language for a Religious Expression Protection Act, legislation designed to prevent any court in the nation from ever penalizing belief as if it were a crime. And when opposition came, as it always did, she didn't flinch. She stood behind podiums, sat before Senate committees, and looked lawmakers in the eye as she said, "The courtroom is not your sanctuary. It belongs to the people, all people." The nation watched and listened, because they knew she had already proved she could stand alone and win. Yet inside her new office, even in the heart of political power, Jasmine never let herself forget where it started. That fine, those digits on paper, were more than an insult. They were a line drawn in ink where fear had once drawn it in silence. She had crossed it, and now she was clearing it for others, one policy at a time, one courtroom at a time. There were nights she stayed long after the halls emptied, the light from her desk the only glow in a sleeping wing. She would lean back in her chair, eyes fixed on that receipt. Not to relive the humiliation, but to remember the cost of indifference, the price of silence, and the power of one act of defiance to ripple through institutions, traditions, and generations. The cross she had once worn now rested in a glass box on her bookshelf, not out of reach, but displayed with reverence. Not as a relic, but as a badge, a reminder that belief should never need permission, and that the Constitution was not a theory, it was a shield, and she had chosen to raise it. So when the president called her name during his next address to the nation, when he said, "Thanks to Jasmine Crockett, faith is no longer on trial in America," she didn't smile for the cameras. She smiled for the truth, because the system hadn't given her power. It had tried to take it. And in standing her ground, Jasmine hadn't just reclaimed her own rights. She'd carved a path for millions who came after. And the framed fine on her wall remained, not as a trophy, but as a promise. Never again. And as Jasmine sat quietly in her new office, the framed fine still glowing softly in the morning light, the outside world erupted, because truth, once unleashed, doesn't wait for permission to move. Within hours of Justice Barrett being let out of the courtroom in handcuffs, footage of the moment, grainy, handheld, unfiltered, had rocketed across the internet like a detonation. Someone in the gallery had captured the very second the handcuffs clicked, the stunned gasp of the crowd, the sharp command from the lead agent. That 14-second clip was reposted over 10 million times within the first day. Newsrooms scrambled, anchors cut into programming, headlines screamed across the nation's screens in bold fonts and staccato urgency. Sitting judge arrested for religious discrimination, live in courtroom. But the name that dominated every headline wasn't Barrett's, it was Jasmine's. She hadn't spoken publicly since the hearing. She hadn't posted a statement. But that silence only made the legend louder. The media gave her a name almost instantly, the quiet warrior of the Constitution. It stuck, not because it was catchy, but because it was true. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't stormed the bench. She had simply stood, spoke with law and logic, and let truth do the damage. And in doing so, she had become something rare, a symbol with no slogan, a fighter with no sword, a reformer born not in office, but in resistance. The wave that followed was immediate, and it was seismic. In Texas, the governor held a press conference within 24 hours, flanked by a coalition of religious leaders and legal advisors. We will be reviewing every court decision in our state from the last 5 years involving claims of religious discrimination, he declared, the Texas flag billowing behind him. Not because we assume guilt, but because trust in justice demands transparency. Ohio followed within hours, announcing a bipartisan committee to audit municipal courts. Then Florida joined, stating flatly, "No bench is immune, no robe makes you untouchable." It wasn't just politics, it was cultural shock. Faith groups from every spectrum, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, released joint statements thanking Jasmine for reminding the country that belief doesn't belong to one party or one interpretation. She had defended the idea that the First Amendment wasn't conditional. It didn't bend under discomfort. And it damn sure didn't stop at courtroom doors. But while the public roared in support, the system itself began to turn inward. Judges who had once nodded in silent agreement with Barrett now found themselves on the defensive. Journalists unearthed transcripts. Advocates filed Freedom of Information Act requests. In district courts across the country, quiet murmurs of pattern and precedent began to echo louder than ever before. Courtroom staff who had stayed silent, clerks, bailiffs, recorders, started speaking up. "She used to do the same," one anonymous clerk said about her own judge in an interview with the Washington Post. "I thought it was just how things worked. Jasmine proved it wasn't." Suddenly, oversight committees had more work than they could process. In D.C., the Judicial Review Board announced an emergency inquiry into 6 other judges accused of similar behavior. Judges whose records bore eerie resemblances to Barrett's. Sentences extended, testimony struck, witnesses dismissed, all with one common trait: religious expression somewhere in the room. Jasmine hadn't exposed a single judge. She had pulled back the curtain on a practice so deeply embedded it had become invisible. Until now. Legal scholars debated it on every channel. "She didn't just cite precedent," one constitutional law professor said on a CNN panel. "She became the precedent." And amid all of this, Jasmine never once claimed credit. She declined every interview. She sent no tweets. Her silence wasn't strategic. It was steady, grounded. While the world reacted, she prepared. While others screamed in outrage or praise, she built policy. Her work was already underway, drafting judicial ethics codes, consulting on new federal guidelines, building a database to track future violations. But even in her silence, she was heard. In a small courtroom in Nebraska, a judge paused his sentencing, looked out over the gallery and said, "This bench is not for my beliefs. It's for the people's rights." Jasmine Crockett reminded us of that. The room applauded, not because of politics, because justice had a name again. And in the courthouse where it all began, someone had placed a single rose on the now empty bench where Barrett once sat. No card, no explanation. Just a silent marker of what had ended and what had begun. Because in just 24 hours, Jasmine hadn't merely changed the course of one courtroom. She had shifted the ground beneath an entire system. And as judges across the country felt the heat of scrutiny begin to rise, the system itself, long shielded by formality and fear, was finally forced to look inward. What began as public outrage and statewide audits quickly escalated into something far more coordinated, far more calculated. Within 72 hours of Justice Barrett's arrest, the Department of Justice and the Office of the Inspector General jointly announced the launch of Operation Blind Gavel, a federal investigation unlike anything in recent memory. Its mission was explicit: to root out systemic patterns of judicial abuse tied to religious discrimination across the United States. Its name was deliberate, Blind Gavel, because justice, they said, had been blindfolded not by impartiality, but by willful ignorance. Teams were formed, sealed indictments were drafted, and internal court communications were subpoenaed across multiple circuits. For the first time in decades, the judiciary itself was the subject, not the speaker. Reporters, stunned by the scale of the probe, called it the most aggressive legal introspection since the Watergate era. The country watched, riveted, as headlines rolled in. Judges resigning under pressure, others lawyering up, some choosing silence, others lashing out. The judiciary, once insulated by the public's lack of access or understanding, was now being dissected, case by case, ruling by ruling, in full view of a nation hungry for accountability. But while investigators combed through decades of misconduct, the White House turned its eyes to something even more radical: prevention. And for that, they knew only one person could lead the charge. Inside the West Wing, in a room where history had been debated but rarely rewritten, Jasmine Crockett stood before a wall of whiteboards, each marked with timelines, legal doctrines, and names of key judicial figures. She had not asked for this position. She hadn't lobbied, hadn't pitched, hadn't raised her hand. She had simply stood when others sat, and for that, she had been handed the most formidable task of her career. The order came straight from the top: create a binding national ethics framework for all federal judges. Not a suggestion, not a code of conduct with loopholes, but a standard, concrete, enforceable, permanent. Something that could outlive administrations, transcend ideologies, and survive courts stacked by politics. Something that would restore the people's faith not in judges, but in justice itself. There was no precedent, no template, no manual, and Jasmine knew exactly why. Because the system had never expected to be reformed by someone it once tried to punish. Her office became a war room, papers scattered across mahogany, experts called in from every corner of constitutional law. Faith leaders, civil rights attorneys, retired justices, each brought their scars and their expertise. Jasmine listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, it was only to cut through the noise with precision. We're not here to punish judges. We're here to prevent the next Barrett from ever sitting behind a bench. Every clause she wrote, every safeguard she built into the policy, came from real pain. Cases like the teenager sentenced for wearing a crucifix, the mother's silence for holding prayer beads, the imam escorted out before he spoke. She etched those stories into policy as if the law itself needed to remember what it had once forgotten. Her first draft, titled the Fair Bench Act, outlined sweeping reforms: mandatory First Amendment training for all sitting judges, an independent federal review board with subpoena power, a public-facing database of judicial complaints, and strict penalties for ideological bias in sentencing. Some called it overreach, some called it political suicide, but Jasmine called it necessary. The president backed her, publicly and without hesitation. "This isn't a witch hunt," he said in a nationally televised address. "This is a rescue mission for justice and for the millions who walk into courtrooms every day praying that their beliefs won't be used against them." His words were met with thunderous applause, but Jasmine didn't hear them from a podium. She was in her office, sleeves rolled, revising Clause 17 to close a loophole on discretionary sentencing. Still, the pushback came. Conservative think tanks accused her of weaponizing oversight. Hardline progressives said the reforms didn't go far enough. Judicial unions threatened walkouts. But Jasmine never swayed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She held the same calm, cold steel that had carried her through Barrett's courtroom. And when asked by a journalist if she feared the scope of what she was building, she answered without blinking, "What I fear more is another generation too afraid to speak." And so Operation Blind Gavel pressed forward, exposing, confronting, shaking the foundations of unchecked power. And in a room just steps from the Oval Office, Jasmine Crockett wrote history, not with speeches but with statutes, not with protests but with policy. She was not trying to be remembered. She was trying to make sure others were never forgotten. Because justice, she believed, was not blind. It was watching. And now, finally, it had opened its eyes. And as Jasmine's reforms gained traction, gaining legal momentum and national support, the very system she was rebuilding began to reveal its resistance. Deep, bitter, and dangerously quiet. It started subtly: press releases from obscure judicial councils, opinion columns from concerned constitutionalists, anonymous op-eds warning of executive overreach cloaked in reform. But soon it sharpened into something far more coordinated. A coalition emerged, an alliance of hardline federal judges, career politicians with ties to legacy court structures, and deep-pocketed lobbyists who had long viewed the judiciary as their last untouchable fortress. They gave their movement a name: Hands Off the Bench. It sounded innocuous, almost reasonable, but behind the slogan was a brutal campaign designed to discredit, dismantle, and destroy Jasmine's credibility. Their message flooded certain media outlets. Crockett is a political puppet, they claimed, an activist in a suit, a mouthpiece for a White House bent on controlling the courts. Primetime anchors questioned her legal experience, twisted her courtroom stand into a PR stunt, and painted her as a threat to judicial independence. But it didn't stop with talking points. It got personal. Leaked emails began to surface. One in particular drew national attention. Dated 2 months before Barrett's arrest, written by a former senior aide to the judge, the message was blunt, venomous, and chilling in its arrogance. "We spent a decade building this structure, carefully, quietly. She's not going to tear it down just because she wore a cross and made a scene." The email ignited a firestorm. The public was stunned by its cold confidence, but to Jasmine it confirmed what she already knew. She wasn't just fighting policy. She was fighting power, entrenched, generational, ruthless, and the backlash escalated. Security at her office was doubled after an anonymous threat scrawled in red ink was delivered to her West Wing mailbox. "We don't need judges who fear God. We need ones who fear us." Her staff grew quiet, more alert, more careful. Background checks were rerun. Visitors were vetted twice. Jasmine didn't flinch, but she adjusted. Her every movement was tracked now, by allies and enemies alike. Then one morning, as the sun rose over Washington, she arrived at her office to find a sheet of paper taped to the glass door. It wasn't typed. It wasn't even large. Just a single handwritten line, black ink bleeding slightly into the paper from the morning dew. "Justice does not belong to the ones who disrupt it." For a brief moment, her reflection stared back at her in the glass. Tired eyes, steady hands, and a cross pinned just beneath her collar. She read the line again, peeled it from the door, folded it once, and placed it into her drawer. Not out of fear, but for the record. Because every threat was evidence. Every pushback a sign she was exactly where she needed to be. The media grew more divided with each passing day. Some headlines painted her as a reformist hero, the last guardian of the First Amendment. Others labeled her a bureaucratic extremist, dragging the courts into political warfare. Cable news panels turned into shouting matches over her name. Protests formed outside district courts, some in support, others demanding her resignation. Jasmine stayed silent. She refused to be baited into televised battles. Her battlefield was policy, paper, precedent. But the toll was real. She slept in 3-hour windows. Security briefings were added to her morning schedule. Her family was advised to avoid public events. At times, the silence in her office became so loud it pressed against her chest. Yet she never stopped writing, never stopped refining, because every insult hurled at her reforms confirmed exactly why they were necessary. When a reporter asked her during a closed-door session why she hadn't backed down despite the attacks, Jasmine simply replied, "If the system shakes when it's questioned, it was never stable to begin with." She continued drafting the judicial code, now with provisions for whistleblower protection, transparency clauses, and a public complaint registry. Each page became a shield not for her, but for those who would one day sit in courtrooms wearing symbols of faith, belief, and identity. For the ones who wouldn't have a badge, or a camera, or an audience. Just the truth, and a system that had once punished them for it. Jasmine knew what she was building wasn't just controversial, it was revolutionary. And revolutions don't ask for permission. They write new rules, even when the old ones come at them with fists clenched and robes flying. And as the threats deepened and the rhetoric sharpened, Jasmine Crockett made a choice that would echo louder than every whisper behind her back. She did not retreat. She stepped forward. With the nation divided and the judiciary under unprecedented scrutiny, the White House greenlit what would become the most public-facing judicial event in modern American history. A live federal forum titled The Hearing of Hope. It wasn't held behind closed doors. It wasn't limited to press insiders or legal elites. It was televised, streamed, and open to every citizen, a national reckoning in real time. The hearing took place in the National Convention Center, where towering flags flanked the marble stage, and every seat in the 2,000-capacity hall was filled. Judges, faith leaders, law students, whistleblowers, victims. Outside, thousands more gathered, eyes fixed on mobile screens, monitors, and jumbotrons. This wasn't a debate. It was a confrontation with truth. One by one, survivors of judicial bias took the stage. Not celebrities, not officials, but ordinary people who had been silenced in the very rooms where justice was meant to speak. A teenager recounted how his school prayer group had been labeled disruptive during a disciplinary hearing. A Muslim business owner described how his courtroom testimony was dismissed after he refused to remove his prayer cap. A Catholic nurse broke down in tears, recalling the moment a judge asked if she was too religious to think clearly during a labor dispute. Their stories weren't just heartbreaking, they were undeniable. The room didn't applaud, it absorbed. With every voice, the air thickened, not with outrage, but with the heavy weight of reality long denied. Then came the experts, constitutional scholars, professors, former federal prosecutors, all invited to speak not with emotion, but with authority. They reviewed transcripts, highlighted patterns, dissected the Crockett v. Barrett case as if it were a chapter from a future law textbook. One panelist, a former circuit court judge, put it plainly, "This isn't an anomaly, it's a crack in the foundation." Jasmine Crockett didn't expose one judge, she exposed how silence was baked into the process. Camera lenses panned to Jasmine as she listened, her face composed but unreadable. She hadn't spoken all day. She sat at the head table, silver cross gleaming faintly at her collarbone, a silent echo of the moment that started it all. Her hands were folded, her gaze steady. Not once did she interrupt. She was there not as a spectacle, not as the center, but as a witness to the nation's own awakening. Then finally, near the close of the 6-hour hearing, the moderator stood and called her name. The room quieted again. Not like before, when waiting for policy, but as if waiting for permission to feel. Jasmine stood slowly, walked to the center of the stage, and adjusted the microphone. No teleprompter, no speech cards, just her voice, and it cut with the same precision it had in the courtroom. "I didn't come here to teach the law," she began, voice low but strong, filling the silence like a rising tide. "I came here to remind us all, the law is not a weapon, it is a shield meant to protect citizens from power that forgets its purpose." Her words moved without flourish, without dramatics, only with truth, and the undeniable authority of someone who had stood toe-to-toe with the system and refused to blink. Too often we've watched courts become chambers of silence. Too often justice has worn a robe but not a conscience. And too often people of faith, any faith, have been made to choose between belief and dignity. She looked out across the room, rows of faces, some tear-streaked, all waiting. "I don't want thanks. I want reform. I don't want applause. I want policy. And I don't want to be remembered as the one who stood up. I want to be the reason others never have to kneel." The room remained still, no movement, no chatter, just breath held in reverence. "The system didn't fail because it made mistakes," she said in closing. "It failed because it punished those who dared to name them." And with that, she stepped back. The silence that followed was deafening, not because of emptiness, but because it was earned. A silence of truth finally heard, a silence before change, a silence before the storm Jasmine Crockett had been preparing for all along. The kind of silence that comes right before the sound of something greater. Justice, finally waking up. And as the final words of Jasmine's speech echoed through the hearing of hope, leaving the chamber suspended in a silence more powerful than applause, the country took its next breath, not in fear, but in motion. For weeks following the hearing, momentum surged. Her words were replayed across every major network, dissected in classrooms, and printed on posters in civic halls. But more than just conversation, they sparked legislation. After months of deliberation, drafting, and negotiation with the Department of Justice, civil rights organizations, judicial oversight boards, and bipartisan congressional leaders, something once thought impossible became real. The United States Judicial Ethics Code for Religious Liberty, the first federal mandate of its kind, was signed into law. The signing ceremony was brief, purposeful, and broadcast live to the nation. The president, flanked by Jasmine and two representatives from interfaith organizations, spoke only a few words before lifting the pen. This is not about religion. This is about protection, about fairness, about ensuring that no citizen ever walks into a courtroom fearing their faith might silence them. And with the final stroke of ink, the code was ratified. The document, over 200 pages in length, outlined mandatory training for all federal judges, reinforced strict disciplinary consequences for faith-based discrimination, and established an independent watchdog agency with public reporting power. It was dense, detailed, and above all, enforceable. Jasmine had ensured that. She had read every page, line by line, clause by clause, every statute born of the stories she had heard firsthand, every policy written with the steel of a woman who once held a $1,000 fine as both burden and badge. But what followed next would become the most unexpected tribute of all. Weeks after the law was signed, as implementation began across federal courts, an announcement came from the Supreme Court building itself, an institution not known for symbolism or sentiment. The Judicial Historical Society, along with the court's own Preservation Commission, had unanimously approved the installation of a permanent display in the main hall of the Supreme Court. Not a statue of a justice, not a plaque listing names, but something smaller, a bronze sculpture, simple, elegant, exact. It was the image of a necklace, a silver cross caught mid-sway as if still hanging from a collar in defiance. No body, no face, just the chain, captured in motion, frozen in courage. Beneath it, carved into the marble base, were words now etched into the country's conscience. One small symbol, one monumental shift. The installation ceremony was held at dawn, before the building opened to the public. No cameras, no speeches, just a quiet gathering of those who understood what it meant. Jasmine arrived last, dressed simply, blazer pressed, that same silver cross, her father's, now resting once more at her neck. She approached the statue slowly, alone, her heels echoing across the marble floor. And for a long moment, she stood still. Not out of pride, not out of disbelief, but in remembrance, because she remembered what it felt like to be fined for wearing that very symbol. To stand in a courtroom not as a lawyer, not as an official, but as a threat. To be told that her belief didn't belong, not in words but in glares, in gavel slams, in silence. And now the very heart of the institution that once allowed that injustice had been forced to acknowledge it. Not with an apology, but with permanence. Around her the silence held, not cold, not empty, but sacred. A justice of the Supreme Court, quietly stepping forward, broke the stillness with a nod. "We don't honor you because of the controversy," she said, her voice steady. "We honor you because you reminded us what we're supposed to stand for." Jasmine didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her presence said enough. She placed her fingers gently on the edge of the bronze base, where the last line of the engraving ended. Then turning away, she walked back down the hall toward the massive doors, the symbol still shining quietly at her throat. Outside, reporters waited. Supporters gathered. Protesters stood nearby, signs raised. But Jasmine passed through them all, eyes forward, footsteps calm. Because she had never done it for them, or even for herself. She had done it for the ones who still walked into courtrooms afraid to wear what they believed. Now they didn't have to. And inside the most powerful court in the nation, a cross no longer had to be hidden. It stood in bronze, and it would never be moved. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. 25 million people watched it happen. Live. The entire nation held its breath as comedian Trevor Noah went head-to-head with civil rights attorney Jasmine Crockett on national television. But what Jasmine revealed on air Secret contracts, damning emails, and a hidden video was so explosive, Trevor walked off the stage without saying a word. Was it a setup, a political takedown, or did Jasmine just expose one of the biggest media manipulation scandals of the year? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The American Spotlight studio burned under harsh lights, tense like a battlefield before fire. Cameras loomed overhead like silent snipers, waiting for the first crack. The audience packed in, suits stiff, MAGA caps tilted, faces locked in focus. Not a word, not a laugh, just breath, shallow, synced, strained. Security lined the walls, statues in dark suits. Jack Harper entered from stage left, not walking but marching. A former war correspondent turned primetime anchor, Jack wasn't known for small talk. His voice was a gravel storm, every word deliberate and heavy. Tonight, he said, pausing like a judge before the verdict, is not about opinions, it's about exposure. This is no longer a conversation, it's a confrontation. His eyes scanned the studio like a general gauging the battlefield. The monitors behind him showed two faces, Trevor Noah on the left, Jasmine Crockett on the right. And in this war of words, Jack continued, only one truth will stand. Trevor Noah sat already in his chair, legs crossed, his smile lazy but eyes calculating. He wore a dark navy blazer, clean cut, television perfect. But if you looked closely, his fingers interlocked on the table betrayed something else. Tightness, control, maybe even fear. He had built his brand on being unshakable, witty under pressure, a mirror to political hypocrisy. But tonight was different. He wasn't surrounded by laugh tracks and liberal producers. Tonight he was in enemy territory, and he knew it. Then came Jasmine Crockett. No teleprompter, no entourage, just heels clicking on studio floor like gunfire. A Harvard-trained lawyer with the fire of street protest in her blood, she had taken on corporate giants, police departments, and corrupt officials, and won. Her hair pulled tight, her suit sharp, and her eyes sharper. She didn't look like she came to debate. She looked like she came to deliver a sentence. In her hand, a single black folder. No theatrics, just facts. Cold, heavy, and possibly fatal to careers. As she sat, the studio froze. A cough, a whisper, phones raised. The air was thick, like a storm about to hit. This wasn't a show. This was a strike, and someone was going down. The silence held for just a moment longer. Then Jasmine leaned forward, eyes locked on Trevor like a predator who'd studied every weakness. Her posture was controlled, almost relaxed, but every inch of her body radiated intent. The black folder sat untouched in front of her like a grenade waiting for its pin to be pulled. She didn't need theatrics. Her words would be enough. Her voice was even, cool, not loud, but it carried with the clarity of a courtroom verdict. Trevor Noah, she began, her gaze steady, is not just a comedian. He's not some neutral entertainer cracking jokes about life and politics from the sidelines. She paused, letting the weight of that land. No, he is a coordinated campaign, a production, a scripted performance masked as humor, but crafted to distort, divide, and discredit. The audience was frozen, barely blinking. What you've watched all these years wasn't improvisation. It was calculated messaging, disguised with charm and punchlines, she continued. Each joke wasn't just funny, it was targeted. Each laugh wasn't just spontaneous, it was rehearsed. It's a show dressed up as truth, designed to make one side look stupid and the other look like saviors. And Trevor? He's the lead actor in a play that pretends to be balanced while tipping the scales. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The certainty in her tone hit harder than shouting. This isn't about comedy, she said. It's about control. It's about weaponizing humor to undermine people who think differently, and doing it while pretending you're just keeping it real. Jasmine's hand rested lightly on the folder now. You built your brand on being clever, on being the outsider who sees through the noise. But what happens when the one pointing fingers is just as scripted as those he mocks? Then she leaned in just slightly, her voice dropping by a fraction. This is not a debate, Trevor. This is exposure. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Then Trevor leaned back, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He chuckled, slow and deliberate. The kind of laugh meant more to stall than to express anything real. "So let me get this straight," he said, tapping a finger on the edge of the table. "You're accusing me of writing jokes the way a prosecutor builds a case?" His tone was light, but behind the smirk, something flickered. Annoyance, maybe fear, maybe both. "You really think my monologues are blueprints for brainwashing?" The crowd shifted, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. "Look, I've been doing this for years," he continued, voice sharper now. "I call out hypocrisy, I talk about the headlines, and yes, I use humor. That's what comedians do. I didn't know telling the truth with a punchline made me a criminal." He leaned forward just a little, locking eyes with Jasmine. "Or maybe the real problem isn't the jokes. It's that they hit too close to home." Trevor's words lingered in the tense air, but before the room could exhale, Jasmine answered, sharp, steady, and straight to the heart. "If you truly don't realize you've been funded to steer public opinion," she said, voice calm but unflinching, "then this is far more serious than I thought." Her words didn't rise, didn't shake, but the cold clarity behind them hit harder than any shout. Trevor's expression held still for a moment, but something subtle shifted in his posture. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowed, and for the first time that night, he didn't have a comeback ready. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. She didn't blink. She didn't need to. Her silence between the sentences was just as loud as the statement itself. Around them, the crowd began to stir. First a quiet shuffle, then whispers spreading like a current across the room. Someone in the back let out a skeptical scoff. Then louder, "Where's the proof?" Another voice joined in, this time urgent, demanding, "Show us what you've got." The tension in the room twisted, rising like pressure under a sealed lid. Phones tilted higher, camera lenses narrowing in, mouths half open, ready to react. Trevor sat back slightly, trying to hold his ground, but his fingers tapped against the table. Faster than before, just enough to notice. Jasmine stayed still. The chaos didn't touch her. She didn't rush. She didn't smile. She let the crowd grow restless because she knew what was coming, and so did Trevor. With the precision of someone who had done this before, not on a stage but in courtrooms, depositions, and closed-door hearings, Jasmine slowly reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a black folder. No flash, no sudden movement. It wasn't meant to be theatrical. It was deliberate, focused, the kind of calm that made people nervous because it only showed up when someone had nothing left to prove. She laid the folder flat on the center of the table between them. A simple black leather case, no logos, no markings, just clean, worn at the corners from use. When it touched the table, the sound was soft, barely audible. But somehow it echoed. It echoed because the room had fallen completely, unnaturally silent. Every camera lens zoomed in. Every audience member leaned forward, just slightly, unconsciously, as if drawn by gravity. Trevor didn't say a word. His fingers, which had been tapping just moments ago, now locked together tightly in his lap. His eyes followed her movements like a chess player watching the next move. Too late to stop it, too proud to retreat. Jasmine unzipped the folder. Her expression never changed. Her breath steady, unshaken. She didn't glance at the audience. She didn't even glance at Trevor. Her eyes were on the papers, one by one, like a surgeon lifting instruments. The first document came out slowly. Jasmine held it up with two fingers and placed it neatly on the table, angled toward the camera. It was a copy of a wire transfer, not a vague receipt, a detailed, verified document. The logo of a well-known San Francisco-based nonprofit appeared in the top left corner. The recipient, a media content production company with direct ties to The Daily Show's satellite team. The amount, $2.7 million. The note, for strategic comedic engagement, targeted political messaging, Phase 2, anti-MAGA. She didn't need to say anything, but she did. Calm, measured, clear. $2.7 million, transferred in one payment, not over time, not spread across departments, one lump sum. Her voice cut through the tension with a scalpel's edge. And if anyone in this room still believes this is just comedy, Then maybe they need to read the line marked intended use. Murmurs rose from the audience like steam from boiling water, whispers turning into audible disbelief. A few gasps. One person shouted, "That's not satire. That's a hit job." But Jasmine didn't acknowledge them. Her attention was on the next page. She pulled it from a separate sleeve, unfolded it neatly, and placed it beside the first. An email. Real, unredacted, printed in black ink with a timestamp and sender details. The sender? A senior producer within Trevor's own team. The subject line? Weekly viewer metrics. But the message body was far more telling. Jasmine read it aloud, not with anger, but with the clarity of someone reciting a sworn statement. Need to double down on MAGA ridicule. Engagement is up 24%. Audience responds strongest when Trevor leans in hard. Push sharper writing. Avoid nuance. A few people in the crowd laughed nervously, as if unsure what side they were on anymore. Others didn't laugh at all. One woman put her hand to her mouth. One man lowered his phone. The realization was beginning to settle in, not just that Trevor may have crossed a line, but that it was all laid out in front of them, in ink. Trevor shifted in his chair. Barely, just enough for the camera to catch the movement. He reached for his water but didn't take a sip. He was listening now, really listening. Jasmine moved on to the final page. This time she didn't lift it. She slid it from the folder, placed it dead center on the table, and let the weight of it linger. It was a contract, a production agreement bearing Trevor's name, his signature, the seal of the studio, and a red underline across a very specific clause. Performance bonuses tied to digital reach, minimum 10 million views. Priority content, U.S. conservative political figures and ideologies. Emphasis on satirical contrast and ridicule. She didn't need to add commentary, but she did, softly and with precision. A bonus, not for creativity, not for impact, not even for reach alone. A bonus for targeting a political group, for tearing down an ideology, wrapped in the clothing of comedy. She looked at him for the first time since opening the folder. Tell me, Trevor, do the laughs still feel honest when you know what they're worth? The air in the room didn't just thicken, it locked, like doors had quietly shut and windows sealed without warning. Trevor held his posture, but his expression betrayed something else now. Not just resistance, not just denial, but awareness. The kind that only comes when you realize the ground beneath you isn't as solid as it once felt. Jasmine rested both hands on the edge of the table. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. Comedy is a tool, she said, eyes locked with his. A powerful one. It can open minds, cut through lies. But in the wrong hands, it stops being truth dressed in laughter. It becomes something else, a weapon. She let the silence stretch for just one breath longer. And tonight, I'm showing them who's holding it. The silence held for just a heartbeat longer. Then, like pressure finally bursting through a sealed pipe, Trevor rose from his seat, and the calm was shattered. He stood tall, shoulders squared, but his jaw was clenched tight and his lips pressed into a thin, hard line. His hands, steady a moment ago, now trembled faintly as he pointed toward the folder spread across the table. I've spent my career using comedy to call out what's absurd, he said, his voice sharp, clipped, barely containing the storm behind it. I've used laughter to question power, not to serve it, and I've never taken money to lie to anyone. He turned toward the nearest camera, eyes burning with defiance. What are these? He demanded, gesturing sharply at the documents. Who verified them? Who vetted them? They could have come from anywhere. For all we know, they're props, stage pieces in her show. The audience jolted at the accusation. Gasps broke out, quickly followed by loud voices colliding in midair. One side erupted, chanting, Trevor! Trevor! Like a rallying cry from a battleground. He doesn't bow! One man shouted from the third row, fist raised, eyes wild with conviction. Another shouted back across the aisle, No backing down! Speak your truth! Trevor remained standing, his body angled toward Jasmine now, eyes flashing with both anger and exhaustion. You want to smear me with paper and buzzwords? He snapped. Try facts, not theatrics. But the other side of the room wasn't silent. They rose like a counterwave, voices rising to match the chaos. "Show the video!" a woman yelled, her voice cracking with urgency. "Drop it now, Jasmine!" Another man followed, practically leaning out of his seat, his phone held high. "Prove it!" Their voices were raw, passionate, split between hunger for justice and the thrill of the moment. This was no longer just an interview. This was a war zone made of words, perception, and politics. The air in the studio thickened, not just with sound, but with heat, tension, and the weight of something about to break. Trevor's eyes flicked back toward the camera. He took a step forward, slow and deliberate, planting himself in front of the lens like a man standing trial before the court of public opinion. "I don't play for side," he said, quieter now but sharper, "and I don't twist truth for applause. Everything I've said on record. I've never needed backroom deals or secret donors to know what I believe." His voice cracked, just barely, and he caught it, steadied it. What's happening here? This isn't about truth. It's about spectacle. And some of you are already buying it." Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to. She watched him, cool, unreadable, as if observing a storm she'd already forecasted. The lights overhead seemed to bear down harder now, shadows carving deeper lines into Trevor's face. Sweat glistened at his temple, but he didn't wipe it away. Maybe he didn't notice. Maybe he didn't care. The audience was no longer a crowd. It was a split jury, each side convinced the other had been lied to. Phones kept rolling. Comments were being typed in real time. "Trevor's getting railroaded," one live stream caption read. Another blazed, "She's got him cornered." It wasn't just a debate. It was a media trial with no judge, no rules, only emotion. Trevor turned again to Jasmine, voice low, fists clenched. "If you have something real," he said, "then bring it. But don't act like a few headlines and typed up PDFs are enough to define who I am. You want to bury me with a folder? Then read every line, aloud. Now let the world see if it holds up to the light." He paused, breathing heavy, chest rising and falling, as if each word had cost him more than he expected. "But if you're just here to perform, to win followers and retweets, then congratulations. You've already got your moment." The crowd roared again, divided and deafening. The studio had become a crucible, voices bouncing off the walls, echoing through the tension like the rattle of sabers before a duel. Every face was turned forward, some angry, some afraid, all captivated. Some saw Trevor as the victim of a political ambush. Others saw a man unraveling under pressure, cracking beneath the weight of his own contradictions. He remained standing, unmoving, a statue built from resistance and pride, surrounded by noise he couldn't control. The lights didn't soften, the cameras didn't blink, and somewhere in the blur of chance and accusations, the line between truth and theater had all but vanished. The shouting in the room still lingered like smoke after a blast. But Jasmine didn't raise her voice to meet it. Instead, she smiled, calm and cold, like someone who already knew the final move on the board. She didn't rush. Her composure was unnerving, quiet, calculated, and entirely in control. As the noise dipped just enough to hear a pin drop, Jasmine leaned in slightly, her eyes locked on Trevor with surgical precision. That smile, not wide, not warm, but sharp as a scalpel, stretched across her face as if to say, "You walked into this trap yourself." Her voice dropped, smooth and deliberate. "If Trevor is really as innocent as he claims," she said, "then maybe he can explain something simple." She let the words hang there, let the weight settle before cutting through it. "Why did you refuse every single invitation to speak, on record, live, with conservative platforms after you left The Daily Show?" The question didn't come as an accusation. It came like a challenge issued from higher ground. No rage, no theatrics. Just a slow, undeniable tightening of the noose. Trevor's expression didn't change at first, but the shift was there. A subtle tightening around the eyes. A second too long before answering. He straightened up, as if to summon the weight of his past credentials to brace himself. "Because I don't debate with people who don't want to listen," he shot back, tone firm, voice louder now, edged with frustration. I've spent years watching those platforms twist facts, interrupt guests, and turn everything into a circus. I'm not stepping into a trap where the goal isn't dialogue, it's demolition. He looked around the room as he spoke, trying to draw sympathy from the crowd, but the response wasn't what he expected. Some nodded, others didn't. A few arms crossed. The silence that followed wasn't in his favor. It was laced with doubt. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She let his words hang just long enough to feel like an excuse, then calmly slid her voice between the silence like a blade between ribs. "No," she said simply, her tone firmer now, every word placed like stone. "It's not because they won't listen." She leaned forward just a touch, voice low but unmistakable. "It's because they had evidence, and you knew it." The audience stirred, more alert now, as if waking to something they hadn't fully considered before. "You didn't walk away to protect your principles. You walked away to avoid the spotlight when it wasn't scripted." She moved with the same precision that had defined every moment since the broadcast began. No rush, no flourish, just cold, deliberate control. From the inside pocket of her blazer, Jasmine pulled out a small, silver USB drive and held it between her fingers like a scalpel. The studio lights caught the edge of the metal, casting a brief flicker across the table, as if signaling the sharpness of what was about to come. Her voice, low and unwavering, cut through the tension like a wire snapping under pressure. "This," she said, "is a recording from an internal editorial meeting at The Daily Show." She didn't raise it for the camera, didn't wave it for effect. She simply placed it on the table in front of her, beside the documents. "In this footage," she continued, "Trevor says, word for word, if we want to keep our ratings up, we target Trump." A murmur rolled through the audience, not loud but unmistakably charged, like the distant tremble before a landslide. Jack Harper, still seated between them like a referee in a heavyweight bout, leaned forward slightly. His voice, deep and slow, carried the weight of the moment. "Trevor," he said, eyes narrowing, "are you willing to watch this video, right now, in front of the country?" It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even a dare. It was an invitation to face something he may not have expected to surface. The question floated in the air, unanswered, as all attention turned to Trevor. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Jasmine, long and hard, not blinking. There was no humor left in his expression now. The charm, the wit, the polished performer who once ruled late night, he was gone. What remained was a man cornered, processing a threat he didn't fully control. Slowly, he shifted his gaze to the camera directly in front of him. The red light above the lens glowed steadily, watching him the way the country now was, without judgment, but with complete focus. And still, he said nothing. The silence expanded. Not the kind that falls from confusion or awkwardness, but the kind born from pure tension, when even breath feels like noise. Jack didn't repeat the question. Jasmine didn't move. The studio was still, as though the entire production had frozen in time. Only Trevor remained in motion, just barely. His eyes flicked once, back to the USB, then to the crowd, then again to Jasmine. His jaw clenched, his shoulders stiffened, but his lips didn't move. Not a word, not a nod, not even a refusal. Just silence. Absolute, telling silence. The audience leaned in, some instinctively, some without realizing. Phones stayed up, cameras still rolling, each frame capturing the unraveling of a man known for never missing a beat. Somewhere in that stretch of breathless seconds, the question stopped being about whether Trevor would watch the video and became something deeper. If he had nothing to hide, why hesitate? And if he did, how much longer could he hold the silence before it turned into surrender? The tension in the studio was now electric, almost unbearable. The kind of moment that doesn't need commentary because it's already louder than any headline. Trevor Noah, once in control, now sat in a stillness that screamed. Not answering was an answer, and the room knew it. The silence had roared louder than any scream, and still Trevor said nothing. But in that stillness, something shifted. An internal line crossed, a decision made. What followed wasn't defeat, it was exit. Trevor reached for the microphone slowly, his movements heavy, deliberate, like a man carrying weight that no one else could see. The cheers, the doubt, the pressure, it all seemed to collapse inward as he wrapped his fingers around the mic, then pulled it gently from its stand. No defiance, no outburst. Just a subtle resignation etched into every line of his face. He looked up, not at Jasmine, not at Jack Harper, not even at the audience, but directly into the camera lens. It was the kind of stare that cuts past the lights and the noise, straight into the homes of millions watching. The kind of stare that says this isn't a performance anymore. "I'm not afraid of the truth," he said, his voice low, clear, and stripped of all stage polish. "But I won't be a part of this circus. I came here to speak, not to be dragged through a game dressed up as justice." His grip on the mic tightened once before he slowly set it down on the table, the metallic tap of it touching wood sounding louder than any shout from the crowd. "This isn't surrender," he continued, jaw clenched, eyes unwavering. "I'm walking away not because I lost, but because I still have something worth protecting." Then, without waiting for a response, without seeking applause or sympathy, he turned and walked. He didn't look back, not once. Each step echoed beneath the studio lights, crisp against the polished floor. The studio burst into chaos behind him, half the audience shouting his name, fists raised in furious support, while others screamed at him to face the footage, to prove them wrong. But he didn't flinch. The lights cast long shadows in front of him as he moved off stage, his back straight, movement steady, even as the roar behind him grew. Some called it brave, some called it cowardice. But in that moment, Trevor Noah wasn't delivering punchlines. He was leaving something behind. Jasmine didn't move, not at first. She remained seated, composed, her hands still resting on the table, her posture unshaken by the sudden vacuum left in Trevor's place. The camera swiveled, trying to capture both her stillness and his retreat, but she remained the fixed point in a room spinning on the edge of disbelief. She didn't chase the moment. She didn't revel in it. And when she finally stood, it wasn't with triumph, but with certainty. Her voice came not as a declaration, but as a verdict. "That," she said, each word cutting through the noise, "is what happens when the spotlight finds something real." She turned slightly toward the crowd, not needing to raise her voice to be heard. When the truth steps forward, the act walks away. The words didn't thunder, they didn't scream, but they hit harder than anything she had said all night. There was no gloat, no fire, just ice. The audience didn't know how to respond at first. They were still watching Trevor's silhouette disappear into the black edges of the studio. He had dropped the mic without drama, but it echoed in every mind. An unspoken sentence that would soon be argued over in tweets, headlines, reaction videos, and political feeds. But Jasmine remained still in the center of the storm, a figure not of celebration, but of clarity. She had drawn the line, and he had stepped away from it. The lights dimmed slightly as the cameras refocused, recalibrating the moment that had just unfolded. Security stood quietly at the edges, unsure whether to expect applause or a riot. Jack Harper, ever the veteran of on-air tension, remained quiet. Even he knew not to speak yet. The moment didn't need narration, it needed space. Jasmine's eyes didn't follow Trevor. They stayed locked on the camera, as if speaking directly to the millions watching from behind screens. Those who had doubted, those who had defended, and those who still didn't know what to believe. Her voice, when she spoke again, was calm but final. He had the chance to speak. He had the floor. And when asked to face what was behind the curtain, he walked. She let that settle for a breath. You can call it pride. You can call it principle. But don't call it courage. Behind her, Trevor's empty chair still sat under the studio lights, untouched, unmoving, like a monument to everything he didn't say. The mic, cold and silent, reflected the stage lights like steel, and in front of it stood a woman who didn't shout, didn't chase, didn't waver. She didn't need to. The power had already shifted, and the room felt it. Phones were still recording, fingers were already typing, headlines were already forming. But in the heart of that moment, nothing moved. Nothing but the aftershock of a man who chose to leave rather than answer. A man who, for the first time, found himself outside the punchline, and a woman who refused to blink. The lights in the studio faded, but the story was far from over. Outside the walls of American Spotlight, the real storm had only just begun. Digital, viral, and impossible to control. Within minutes of Trevor's silent walk-off, social media ignited like dry brush catching flame. Screens across the country lit up not with analysis, but with reaction. Raw, immediate, tribal. The hashtag number sign, Trevor walks out, rocketed to the top of trending lists, spreading faster than press releases could be drafted. Someone clipped the final seconds of the broadcast, slowed the footage, layered it with cinematic music, strings rising as Trevor stepped away from the mic, his back to the camera, the studio chaos behind him. The caption read, "A man who didn't bend, a voice that chose silence over slander." The video passed 1 million views in under 20 minutes. Comments flooded in like a digital tsunami. "This is what integrity looks like. They tried to corner him, and he walked with dignity. Real leaders don't need to yell." But the counter-narrative was just as fast, just as loud. Another clip, Jasmine standing firm at the table, documents spread like evidence in a courtroom, was already circling Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. A close-up photo of her beside the untouched microphone, eyes sharp, posture unshaken, appeared with a caption just as bold. "The lawyer who brought justice to late-night comedy." People shared it with fire emojis, with words like icon, fearless, truth teller. Political influencers on both sides of the aisle jumped in, some praising Trevor for his restraint, others hailing Jasmine as the face of modern accountability. The digital world didn't wait for the facts. It ran with the feeling, and the feeling was war. News outlets scrambled to keep up. Fox, CNN, MSNBC, all aired breaking panels within the hour. Words like ambush, meltdown, mic drop, and expose flashed across lower thirds. Every commentator had a theory. Every voice claimed insight. But beneath the surface noise, two images dominated the narrative. Trevor's empty chair and Jasmine's still hand resting on the folder. One spoke of retreat, the other of reckoning, but both had power, and the internet couldn't look away. While the online firestorm blazed, the reality behind the screens played out in far quieter spaces. Trevor sat alone in his New York apartment, the same one where he'd written thousands of punchlines, crafted monologues that made people think, laugh, protest. Now the city outside his window buzzed on without him, and his phone, muted, face down, vibrated on the table like a restless truth he didn't want to face yet. In front of him sat an old half-filled notebook, its pages wrinkled and worn from years of travel and late nights. He opened to a fresh page, picked up a pen, and with steady, unhurried strokes wrote, "Sometimes to protect your voice, you have to say nothing at all." He paused. Read the line twice, then closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair, eyes staring at the ceiling, not in defeat, but in reflection. Outside, a siren echoed distantly. Somewhere, another headline published. But in here, it was quiet. Across the country, Jasmine walked out of a packed press briefing, her blazer crisp, her expression unreadable beneath the flash bulbs of a dozen news cameras. Reporters shouted questions, most of which she ignored, her steps unbroken, her focus razor sharp. But as she reached the sidewalk, the chaos parted for something simpler. A little girl, no older than 8, tugged gently at her sleeve. "Are you really a lawyer?" she asked, wide-eyed, the kind of honest curiosity that cuts deeper than any broadcast. Jasmine stopped, looked down, and smiled. Not the smile she wore on stage, not the one trained for the spotlight, but something warmer, fuller. "Yes," she said softly. "I am." The girl beamed. Her mother snapped a picture, and Jasmine bent just low enough to meet her eyes, the weight of the moment not lost on either of them. To the crowd, she was a figure of controversy. To that girl, she was something else entirely, a mirror of what was possible. Jasmine stood back up, nodded once, and disappeared into the waiting car that pulled to the curb. No entourage, no victory lap, just the hum of the engine and a storm of attention following her through the streets of Washington. Back online, the debate only intensified. Viral edits appeared within the hour. Dueling TikToks of Jasmine's cutting questions synced to dramatic scores, and Trevor's walkout layered over Martin Luther King Jr. speeches. Conspiracy theorists began dissecting the USB clip frame by frame, questioning timestamps, lighting angles, even audio quality. Others rushed to verify the documents, digging into nonprofit tax filings, production budgets, and staff records. The facts hadn't changed, but how they were being weaponized had become its own battlefield. Influencers and podcast hosts dropped emergency episodes dissecting the confrontation. Some called it the death of comedy, others called it the rebirth of integrity. One YouTube title read, "Trevor Noah, Hero or Hypocrite," racking up 500,000 views by midnight. In the comments, civil discourse gave way to firestorms. Every opinion was a grenade. Every reply, a battlefield. Meanwhile, in private group chats, political consultants passed around the clips with glee or dread, depending on who they worked for. Campaign teams took notes. Messaging strategies shifted. The showdown had struck a nerve far deeper than the evening's airtime. Because this wasn't just about a comedian and a lawyer. This was about who got to shape the story and who walked away from it. As the night stretched on, the chaos didn't slow. It mutated. Hashtags evolved. Trevor walks out split into Trevor the Brave and Trevor the Coward. Jasmine truth clashed with trial by TV. Memes were minted in real time. One showed Trevor's empty chair with the words, "Integrity, 1, ratings, 0. Another showed Jasmine standing over a chessboard, every piece her opponent's. But inside the silence of those two private moments, Trevor alone with his notebook, Jasmine surrounded by the public but grounded by a child's question, was the only truth that wasn't up for debate. For one, silence was armor. For the other, words were a blade. And both had just learned the cost of carrying either in a world that never stops watching. Tomorrow would bring more headlines, more judgment, more fire. But tonight, the night the truth didn't end with a verdict, but with a walkout, it was clear. This was no longer just a story. It was a reckoning. And it had only just begun. By the time the first light of morning broke over Manhattan, the world wasn't waking up to coffee, it was waking up to chaos. The clip of Trevor Noah walking off the set of American Spotlight had detonated across social media like a controlled explosion, precise in its impact but uncontrollable in its reach. Every platform lit up at once. The war for truth had moved to the trenches of the internet, and within hours the narrative had been torn into pieces, each fragment claimed by a different army. Fox News was first to strike. They aired a segment within the hour, a split screen of Trevor's walkout in Jasmine Crockett's calm composure. The headline was clear, brutal, and loaded. When truth walks in, comedy walks out. Analysts took turns dissecting Trevor's silence, calling it the definitive moment. The left lost its grip on the narrative. They praised Jasmine not just for her evidence, but for her tone, measured, sharp, and unflinching. She didn't just bring documents, one commentator said. She brought a mirror, and Trevor couldn't look into it. MSNBC, in contrast, launched into immediate defense. He wasn't running, their primetime host insisted. He was stepping away from a trap designed to bait him into failure. They painted Jasmine as calculated, even opportunistic, suggesting that her performance was more political than principled. Their special segment was titled, "Dignity in Silence," when a comedian refuses the circus. The hosts argued that Trevor's decision to leave wasn't a collapse. It was a refusal to engage in a spectacle that blurred the lines between journalism and persecution. CNN played it down the middle. Their banner read, "Truth, Drama, and the Death of Nuance." They brought on comedians, legal scholars, political consultants, and even a body language expert to analyze Trevor's posture, Jasmine's tone, and every flicker of tension between them. They aired the full 7-minute exchange without interruption, an attempt at unfiltered context. But by then it was too late. People weren't watching full segments. They were watching moments, seconds, rewound and repurposed until they no longer resembled reality. On Twitter, the hashtags went to war. To Shuksha Trevor Walks, out began trending within 20 minutes of the broadcast ending. Supporters flooded the tag with words like honor, restraint, and real leadership. The most viral tweet came from a political cartoonist, a sketch of Trevor, back turned, walking away from a flaming stage labeled American Spotlight. The caption, "Sometimes walking away says more than staying ever could." But number Jasmine exposed truth was just as relentless. Clips of her calmly laying out the documents, her hand on the USB, her final line. When the truth stepped forward, the act walked away, spread like wildfire. One image in particular, showing Jasmine under the studio lights with the contract and emails spread like evidence in a courtroom, became an overnight symbol. Memes labeled her the lawyer America didn't know it needed. Instagram Reels mashed her footage with speeches from Malcolm X and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. On TikTok, creators reenacted her moment, syncing her voice to dramatic orchestral scores. One video reached 10 million views in less than 8 hours. Meanwhile, the fringe internet boiled over. Conspiracy theorists tore into the footage frame by frame, suggesting that Trevor's walkout had been pre-planned, even staged. Some claimed the USB had been planted. Others alleged that Jasmine had been coached by a political posse. None of it was verified. None of it mattered. In the age of viral proof, speculation travels faster than correction. Podcasters dropped emergency episodes overnight. Political influencers live stream commentary, reacting in real time to reactions themselves. On YouTube, a video titled "Trevor Noah Just Ended His Career on Live TV" hit 1 million views by breakfast. Another, called Jasmine Crockett, The Rise of a New Power, argued that the moment was bigger than either person. "This," the host said, "is about the shifting tide. The people want truth with teeth, and Jasmine delivered it." Think pieces flooded the web. On Medium, one author wrote a 3,000-word analysis titled "The Day Late Night Died." In it, they claimed Trevor's walkout marked the symbolic end of the era where comedians could hide behind satire without being held accountable. On Substack, a rival piece argued, "The weaponization of truth, how viral media creates false heroes." The author accused Jasmine of building a case out of innuendo and optics, not indisputable evidence. Both articles went viral. Neither changed anyone's mind. Celebrities chimed in with vague but provocative statements. A-list comedians tweeted things like, "Silence isn't always cowardice. Sometimes it's wisdom." A well-known civil rights attorney posted a split image. Jasmine beside Angela Davis, captioned, "The torch passes on." Musicians, actors, even athletes posted stories sharing their respect for standing firm. Whether they meant Trevor or Jasmine depended on which version of the story they had clicked on. But amid all the noise, one truth echoed louder than any side could control. No one was watching the full broadcast anymore. They were watching versions, fragments, cuts designed for confirmation, not clarity. The 7-minute confrontation had been sliced into 1,000 narratives, each one tailored to enrage, to inspire, to rally. In one version, Trevor was a martyr, pushed out of the arena for refusing to play dirty. In another, he was a fraud, cornered and exposed, his silence a confession. In one, Jasmine was a hero, fearless and composed, delivering justice in real time. In another, she was an opportunist, calculating and media savvy, manipulating optics for clout. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was which story you clicked on first. And through it all, the video kept climbing. 20 million views, then 30, then 40. But the comments underneath weren't about content. They were about allegiance, about sides. "This is the end of woke comedy." She brought the receipts. He stood his ground. She called his bluff. The same moment split into 1,000 meanings. All true, all false, all weaponized. One viral TikTok said it best, not with rage, not with irony, but with cold, honest clarity. "We don't watch for truth anymore. We watch to see who survives." In the chaos that followed, the confrontation became something it was never meant to be, a symbol. And in the hands of the internet, symbols don't stay still. They evolve, they harden, they break. Trevor's silence became a shield for some, a weapon for others. Jasmine's calm became a beacon for some, a trigger for others. And between them stood the world, not looking for truth, but for validation. Because in this war, truth wasn't lost. It was sliced, shared, and sold, and everyone claimed a piece. While the internet burned and split itself in two, far from the noise of trending hashtags and viral videos, something quieter, yet far more consequential, was taking shape in rooms without cameras. Washington, D.C. was already awake before dawn. Screens lit up not with alarm clocks but with notifications. Phones buzzed on marble countertops, email chains forwarded in all caps. In offices tucked between monuments and lobbying firms, aides were skimming transcripts while pouring their second coffee. It didn't matter whether they supported Jasmine or Trevor. The response was universal. This is political gold. In a downtown strategy suite, 3 campaign operatives sat in silence, watching the viral clip for the 4th time. One leaned forward, pressing pause on the moment Jasmine placed the USB on the table. "That," she said, tapping the screen, "is the frame. That's the image we run with." A man across from her nodded, already drafting a subject line for a fundraising email. Another typed furiously into Slack, "Get graphics team on Jasmine asset pack. Stat." By 9 a.m., Jasmine's team had fielded over 30 media requests, including a primetime CNN slot and an exclusive with The Atlantic. But the calls that mattered most came not from media, but from inside the Beltway. Her name was now being passed around Capitol Hill like a secret too hot to keep. One senator texted a colleague, "This woman's not just sharp, she's fireproof." Another whispered to their chief of staff, "Find out if she's planning a run." In the offices of national PACs, the mood was electric. One group specializing in candidate recruitment had already drafted a pitch deck. Crockett 2026, from cross-examination to Congress. The cover slide featured a still of Jasmine under the studio lights. Folder open, eyes locked on Trevor like a prosecutor with no time for theatrics. Money was already shifting. Emails with subject lines like, "Did you see Jasmine?" and "The future just spoke" began hitting donor inboxes. Some groups didn't even wait for a reply. They just wired seed money. Yet Jasmine wasn't answering the calls. In a black SUV crawling down Constitution Avenue, she sat in the back seat, scrolling through headlines she hadn't asked for and watching videos of herself she hadn't posted. Her phone was at 7%, but she didn't plug it in. She was tired, not exhausted, not drained, wired. The kind of tired that keeps your eyes open even when your body pleads to shut down. Her staff talked in low tones. Media strategy, next appearances, social media filters. She barely registered it. Her mind was still stuck on that moment at the studio. Not the walkout, not the folder, but the silence just before she asked her final question. The moment she felt the room shift. She hadn't expected it to go that far. Not really, not like that. A text popped up from a number she hadn't seen in months. A member of the House Judiciary Committee. Just 2 words. "Let's talk." She locked the screen and slid the phone into her coat, then looked out the tinted window toward the Capitol. A storm was coming. She knew that. But for the first time, she wasn't watching it from a distance. She might be the storm. Elsewhere, miles north, deeper in Manhattan, a different kind of meeting was unfolding. A half-lit boardroom on the 22nd floor of a cable network headquarters. Large glass walls, polished table, cold coffee. Trevor's name was on the agenda, underlined in red. "We've got 2 options," a VP said, scrolling through analytics on his tablet. "Salvage the brand or spin off something new." Around the room, producers and execs sat in varying states of defensiveness, panic, and detachment. One leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "He walked off a stage, not a cliff. Let's not overreact." Another snapped back. "He walked off live," while holding the audience hostage with silence. "That's not principle, that's career suicide." The debate grew sharper. Do they frame Trevor as a man overwhelmed by manufactured drama? Or do they quietly step away from a brand that just went nuclear? A middle-aged PR strategist in the corner finally spoke, cutting through the noise. "The issue isn't what he said or didn't say, it's that he didn't finish the performance." She clicked to a slide, viewer sentiment graphs. Audiences don't forgive unfinished stories. They want resolution, they want redemption or downfall, but never ambiguity. And Trevor Noah had just walked into the one space no network could sell, the gray area. In a separate room on a lower floor, two junior producers watched old clips of The Daily Show. One paused during a 2019 segment where Trevor roasted both sides of the political aisle. "He used to own the room," she said softly. "Now he barely owns the narrative." Her colleague replied without turning his head, "Yeah, and now Jasmine does." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a blown fuse. In smaller circles, private dinners, closed-door briefings, the ripple effects were even more strategic. A well-known conservative think tank began assembling an opposition analysis dossier on Jasmine Crockett, not because she was a threat yet, but because she might become one. "She's dangerous," a strategist told his boss. "Not because she's radical, because she's compelling. She doesn't yell. She doesn't flinch. She just cuts." Meanwhile, Democratic leadership quietly debated whether to embrace her or distance themselves. Some feared her rise might split attention from midterm messaging. Others saw an opening. "She doesn't need grooming," one advisor noted. "She's already primetime ready. Hell, she created it." Outside of politics, big tech wasn't idle either. Streaming platforms floated soft offers, unscripted content, docuseries rights, even a limited biographical feature. A leaked deck titled "Breaking the Laugh Track, The Jasmine Crockett Moment" began circulating between producers. Meanwhile, a rival network ran a poll. Would you watch Jasmine host her own show? The answer, 68% yes. Even Silicon Valley took note. A prominent VC posted, "Whoever signs Jasmine to a platform deal will own the next cultural inflection point." That's not politics. That's pattern recognition. But while others plotted, Jasmine wasn't planning anything. Not yet. She sat alone later that evening in a quiet corner of a Georgetown bar, her coat still on, her phone still buzzing silently in her pocket. Her assistant had taken the rest of the team to dinner nearby. She'd asked for space, for silence. She needed to feel her own thoughts, not the headlines, not the expectations, just the weight of what had happened. The bartender, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s, placed a whiskey neat in front of her. "On the house, she said. "You spoke for a lot of people." Jasmine nodded once, said thank you, but inside she wasn't sure if that was true. She hadn't spoken for anyone. She'd just stopped staying silent, and now everything had changed. The world hadn't stopped spinning, but for the two people at the center of the storm, it had slowed, unnaturally, painfully, and without mercy. Trevor Noah sat alone in his New York apartment, the city's cold neon glow bleeding through half-closed blinds. The room was dark except for the soft blue of his laptop screen and the yellow gold from a desk lamp that barely reached past the clutter of books and papers. On the desk, his old leather notebook lay open, its spine worn, the pages filled with half-finished jokes, story outlines, and headlines scribbled in red ink. It was once his map, his weapon. Tonight, it looked more like a relic. He picked up a pen, tapped the tip against the page, then froze. The sentence he had written earlier still stared back at him. "Sometimes, to protect your voice, you have to say nothing at all." He hated how true it sounded now. It didn't feel like a quote anymore. It felt like a scar. His phone was on silent, flipped upside down. Dozens of unread messages pulsed beneath the screen, some from friends, some from producers, a few from old colleagues who hadn't texted him in years. He knew what they'd say. "You did what you had to do." Or worse, "Why didn't you stay?" He stood up suddenly, pacing across the apartment like a man trying to outrun something that lived inside him. This wasn't just about the broadcast. It was about everything it cracked open. He had built a career on words, precise, clever, cutting. But now silence had become the loudest thing he'd ever spoken, and he didn't know if it was bravery or the beginning of disappearing. Outside, sirens passed. Inside, the air was heavy with memory. He thought about South Africa, about stages where no one knew his name, about the early jokes that made people laugh and think at the same time. Back then, comedy felt like rebellion, a way to speak truth without carrying a flag. But now it felt like everything came with a flag. Every joke, every pause, every breath. He sat back down, pen in hand. Then slowly, carefully, he wrote, "The moment you realize your audience isn't laughing with you anymore, They're choosing sides. He stared at it, then drew a line through it. Across the country, in a small townhouse nestled quietly in Northeast D.C., Jasmine Crockett stood barefoot in her kitchen. It was nearly midnight. Her team had gone home hours ago. The world outside was quiet, almost sacred in its stillness. The kettle on the stove hissed faintly. A cup of peppermint tea waited patiently beside a worn legal pad on the counter. She had written nothing. Her phone buzzed again. A new text from a major podcast producer. "We'll give you full editorial control. Just talk." She didn't respond. In the silence, she heard something she hadn't had time to register in days. Herself. Her breathing. The weight of her own thoughts finally uncoiling. She walked to the living room, sat cross-legged on the couch, the tea cradled in her hands. On the coffee table were the notes she'd used for the broadcast. Highlighted, annotated, marked with tabs and underlines. Every word had been chosen carefully, measured, controlled. She had delivered her message like a lawyer in court, but now that the performance was over, something else crept in. Doubt. Not about the facts, not even about Trevor, but about what it had cost. Was this what accountability looked like? Or had she become something she used to warn others about? She reached for the remote, flicked on the muted TV. A news panel dissected the showdown again. 4 commentators, none of whom had been in the room, all speculating on her motives, her tone, her clothing, her silence after his exit. She turned it off. In the quiet that followed, Jasmine thought about her law school days, about the protests she marched in, the cases she fought where no one had a camera. She remembered the first time a client cried in her office, not because they lost, but because she'd believed them when no one else would. That version of herself still lived somewhere beneath the sharp lines and power suits. But after American Spotlight, she wasn't sure if anyone else could see her anymore. To the world, she had become a symbol, but symbols don't get to be human. She took a deep breath, then whispered, not to anyone, just to the room. "I didn't ask for all this." Elsewhere, the ripples continued. In a college dorm room in Chicago, a political science major replayed Jasmine's segment for the 10th time. She paused at the USB moment, mouth slightly open, then pressed record on her phone and said to her followers, "Whatever side you're on, that was history." In a newsroom in Austin, an editor watched Trevor's silent walkout and told his staff, "This isn't about left or right. It's about a man who used to own the narrative, and what happens when the narrative turns on him." In a conference room in Silicon Valley, a tech startup CEO reviewed analytics showing that discussion of Jasmine's name had spiked 2,300% in 24 hours. "This isn't just a moment," he told his board. "This is a new cultural archetype." But neither Trevor nor Jasmine saw any of that. They were off the stage, out of the feed, alone with the parts no one retweets. Later that night, Trevor stepped out onto his apartment balcony, a hoodie pulled tight over his head. The city below glowed, timeless, uncaring. He lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in years. Just one. Just this once. He watched the smoke curl upward, soft and slow. In that haze, he thought of the last thing he could remember, feeling completely proud of. A joke he wrote 5 years ago. Simple, honest, and real. Back then, he said, "The truth is like jazz. It doesn't always resolve." He smiled barely. Now it just trends. Jasmine, still on the couch, finally opened the legal pad. She didn't write facts. She didn't outline speeches. She wrote one question, center of the page. What happens when justice becomes performance? She stared at it, then put the pen down, and sat in silence. Not defeated, not triumphant, just still. As the lights dimmed across every studio, and the echo of viral clips faded into static, something deeper settled beneath the noise. A haunting question that neither a mic drop nor a walkout could answer. What happens when truth becomes a weapon? When facts are filtered through algorithms? When silence is seen as guilt and conviction is mistaken for performance? What's left? That was the raw, unspoken lesson carved out of the wreckage left behind. Trevor Noah didn't fall because he lied. He fell because he chose not to play a game that had already decided the rules. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise because she yelled. She rose because she wielded clarity like a scalpel in a world that rewards chaos. And in the crossfire between them stood something far more fragile than either of their reputations, the very idea that truth could survive the spotlight. Not untouched, not victorious, just intact. In a world addicted to reaction, the greatest act of rebellion might be restraint. Trevor's silence was not a confession, it was a barricade, a final defense against a system that no longer asks, is it true but does it trend? He walked not because he lost the debate, but because he refused to let his voice be hijacked by noise disguised as accountability. That doesn't make him a hero. It doesn't make him a coward. It makes him human, flawed, uncertain, and unwilling to let the stage rewrite his soul. And maybe that's the cost of having a voice today, knowing when to use it and knowing when to walk away before it becomes someone else's. Jasmine's power wasn't just in what she said, it was in her precision. She didn't scream. She didn't grandstand. She asked the questions no one wanted answered. But even clarity comes with consequences. In the public eye, a woman who stands still under fire is either a symbol or a threat. Rarely both. Jasmine didn't just challenge a man, she challenged the comfort of narratives we've all grown used to. That comedy is harmless. That satire isn't strategy. That intelligence wrapped in laughter can't be used to mislead. Her lesson was brutal. Not everything that makes us laugh is innocent, and not everything that speaks softly tells the truth. The injustice wasn't that two brilliant minds clashed. The injustice is what happened after. Neither of them got to define themselves. They were dissected, edited, and rebranded by the machinery of digital culture. Trevor was called weak for walking. Jasmine was called cruel for standing. And the truth, the raw, complicated human truth, was lost in between. What we witnessed wasn't just a media moment. It was a microcosm of the larger war we're all living in, the fight to remain whole while the world tears you into digestible pieces. This story was never just about a show. It was about how we consume people. We demand vulnerability from public figures, then weaponize it the moment it doesn't match our politics. We say we want truth, but we reward drama. We say we want honesty, but we punish nuance. Trevor and Jasmine were never meant to win or lose. They were cast, without consent, as gladiators in an arena built on our attention. And no matter who walked out, the arena always wins. But here's what no one can spin. There was courage in both chairs. The courage to speak. The courage to refuse. The courage to risk being misunderstood in a time where every word is permanent and every silence is politicized. We can debate who had the facts. We can argue about who played it right. But what we can't ignore is that both of them, in their own way, refused to be puppets. The real lesson? In a world where everything is content, integrity is the only thing left that isn't for sale. Trevor kept his, Jasmine held hers, and we, the audience, are left with the burden of deciding whether we want truth or just entertainment dressed like it. The next time someone raises their voice, or chooses not to, remember this moment, not for the clash, not for the memes, but for what it revealed. The truth is not a weapon. It's not a performance. And it's not a side, it's a weight. Heavy, costly, real. And the ones brave enough to carry it don't always leave to applause. Sometimes they leave in silence. Sometimes they stay in fire. And sometimes, just sometimes, both are right. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.